to actually get a free Palestine, we need a socialist Palestine, and we need to put forward a proletarian-led struggle that obviously unites different oppressed groups to actually defeat our class oppressors, which are actually one and the same in the end, like the people who are oppressing Palestinians are oppressing us here. So actually, in that way, like our struggles are super, super linked as working people here in the US, in the Arab world, in Europe, throughout the Middle East, in Latin America, and other parts of the world.
Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. My name is Oden. I'm recording this on October 31st, 24 days since a Hamas-led attack killed 1,400 Israelis. Since then, the State of Israel has pursued a bloody siege on Gaza that has killed over 8,000 Palestinians, 40% of whom were children. The Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, has bombed hospitals and places of worship. They bombed schools and refugee camps, while the government has cut fuel and electricity and prevented aid from entering the Gaza Strip. In short, the Israeli regime is committing, and has been committing over the years, what writer Ilan Pappé calls an incremental genocide against Palestinians. The State of Israel has so far counted on the support of the US and other imperialist powers. President Biden, for example, has requested emergency aid to Israel and has repeatedly said that Israel will not be alone. At the same time, the movement for Palestine is growing internationally. Across the US, people have been marching to demand an end to Israeli atrocities and liberation for Palestine. People are calling out the Biden administration for its support of the genocide going on in Gaza. In France and Germany, protesters have defied bans on pro-Palestine actions and taken to the streets. Demonstrators have also rallied in other countries, like in Turkey and in Iraq. On today's episode, I talk to Maryam Alaniz, a PhD student and writer for Left Voice's international section. Maryam explains how the rightward shift in Israeli politics and the decline of US hegemony globally has sowed the seeds for the current conflict. We discuss how support for Palestinian liberation does not mean supporting the tactics and strategy of Hamas, and why popular support for the struggle in Palestine has surged around the world. Finally, we discuss what we see as the solution to this conflict and what the role is of the working class. As Maryam explains, workers across the world have the power to mobilize and to grind the war machinery to a halt, and to unite to fight for a single, secular, and socialist Palestine on its historic territory with democratic rights for all inhabitants. Here's my interview with Maryam. Maryam, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I want to start with, as usual, kind of like a stage setting question. We obviously don't really have the scope to make this episode like a full overview of like the history of the conflict and things like that, but hopefully we'll touch on a few key historical moments. But I wanted to start by asking if you could talk a bit about the current context of the siege in Gaza. So like, what's the political context in the region? And to be even more specific, why do you think that this conflict escalated now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm going to actually start by talking a little bit about what was happening in Israel leading up to this crisis, because I think it's definitely related to the tendencies toward escalation that we're seeing right now, and as well as like the geopolitical shifts that have been happening in the region and the trends that we're seeing. So, on the one hand, like a lot of other capitalist economies, like Israel is a capitalist economy and has been facing like a structural crisis that's been marked by slow growth, and some are even predicting that because of the current crisis that it might go into a recession, although that's an open question. but looking more at the level of the regime, and the sort of domestic situation in Israel. As we know, like, the current prime minister of Israel is Benjamin Netanyahu, who was previously a prime minister in Israel, and actually during the Trump years was strengthened very much by the support of Trump, because he's had a little bit of a rockier relationship with the democratic regime, or with the democratic wing of US imperialism. But he took over again as Israel's prime minister in January of this year. And this was after years of political instability at the level of the regime, just sort of a shuffling of prime ministers. Um, and the reason why this is important is because he not only came back as prime minister, but he did so at the head of the most right wing coalition that Israel has ever had, in its history, and its government. And just to give a few examples, like, the coalition's agenda includes a full annexation of the West Bank, a complete reversal of, pro LGBTQ legislation, the elimination of laws that protect the rights of women and minorities. So a lot of different types of democratic attacks against democratic rights that not only, of course, first and foremost affect, Palestinians, but also to a certain degree, oppressed sectors within Israel. And as part of this agenda, the plan was also to change a number um, of rules and measures and policies to make it much more easy for the Israeli police and the IDF and soldiers to carry out raids and massacres against Palestinians, as part of their project of Zionist expansion, right, of colonization. So in that context, like, since the start of the year, under Netanyahu and this new government, there's been an enormous increase in attacks against the Palestinian population, actually, particularly in the West Bank. And actually, in this past year, before the current, like, conflict, there was the largest massacre that the state of Israel has carried out in a single day in a city, which was in Nablus. Just to give you an example of the depth of the escalation. And then at the same time, there was also this sort of attempt at a judicial reform, going back to what I was saying earlier, of trying to put forward a number of different policies to make it easier for, the Israeli state to completely colonize the West Bank, and oppress Palestinians even further. And essentially, what this judicial reform was trying to do was to shift power away from the Supreme Court to the Parliament, to fast track basically the policies of Netanyahu. In response to this reform, there was a movement within Israel. There was protests, there were strikes. The protests in some ways were progressive, but they didn't break with Zionism, which is important. But there were protests against the judicial reform, and they actually forced Netanyahu to backtrack on the judicial reform. Although it's still an open scenario still, and in the context of the conflict that's developing, like, we can expect to see obviously more undemocratic attacks, right? Especially in the framework of the unity government that Netanyahu's been able to form in the short term. So that's sort of like, some of the tensions that were happening within Israel, right? At the same
Yeah.
time, like,
Just to speak to that,
yeah,
I think it's so important that you brought up the anti-democratic judicial reforms and things like that. I just wanted to pause on that point for a moment because, like, regarding like the judicial reforms, the rollbacks of LGBTQ rights, the press rights, women's rights, I think this is a really interesting. It's really interesting from the perspective of how we always hear this argument that Israel is like the only democracy in the region, and Israel is like, the sort of like bastion of liberalism, and we see these, images and these news stories about how like friendly the Israeli state is to, queer people in particular. So I think it's like a really important context that you're setting up there, where we're often faced with that argument. But I mean, the reality is that Israel is profoundly undemocratic in so many ways.
Yeah, and I think, and obviously reactionary, as we know, because of its relationship and the way in which it oppresses Palestinians. But I think what's important about all of that is that image was also sold to the Israeli masses, right? Who are obviously overwhelmingly reactionary, but of course not homogenous, right? Politically, and also not homogenous like ethnically, and so on and so forth. Um, but it's important because it is accelerating an experience in some ways also between the Israeli masses and their own government. And it remains to be seen like how far this experience will go, but it's important. It adds a level of instability to the crisis, and it obviously makes it harder for Netanyahu to govern. And obviously, after this crisis, like actually, the IDF is doing like a propaganda campaign within Israel to restore the image of the army after this attack from Hamas, from the most, like isolated sector of the Palestinian population who don't even really have access to clean water. Everything is controlled by Israel, right? And Israel is supposed to be this ironclad security state, especially under Netanyahu, that's backed by the most powerful military in the world. So even the image of that Israel has been undermined. And that obviously is linked to the way in which Israel has gone so far in its offensive against Palestinians to try and reassert itself in the region and also to its own populace. But I can also talk a little bit more about the geopolitical changes that have been happening that I think are really important towards understanding the backdrop
Mhm.
for this crisis, because as we've been writing a lot in the pages of Left Voice, like for some time now, the US has been experiencing a decline in its hegemony around the world, like concretely, a sort of crisis of US imperialism that I think is especially expressed in the region after disastrous interventions in Iraq, in Afghanistan. As you know, like there was a huge crisis with Biden when he was trying to withdraw the troops from Afghanistan, because what came in its place after that regime change? An even more reactionary version of the Taliban, right? So we're, in the aftermath of those costly and deadly and horrific interventions that were totally reactionary on the part of US imperialism, there's more instability in the region and there are power vacuums. And obviously, the countries that are competing with the US for influence, like China, for example, but even other regional actors like Iran have been taking advantage of this decline in US hegemony. And so against this general backdrop, earlier this year, China was actually able to broker a normalization of relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is, you know, super significant because they've been regional rivals for many years now. So it really goes to show like the growing role that China has in the region. And this was obviously a huge blow to US imperialism, but also Israel in particular. And so as a response, the Biden administration tried to broker a normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which, of course, as we know, has been a historic ally of US imperialism, but in recent years has been playing a more independent role. And now, because of this conflict, like that's completely off the table. And obviously, it's not entirely clear what, like triggered or set off the decision to go on the offensive against Israel on the part of Hamas. But clearly, this deal that Biden was trying to broker between Israel and Saudi Arabia would have been a huge blow to Hamas and obviously, especially Iran. And of course, there's a relationship between Hamas and Iran. Iran politically supports Hamas, and sends like arms and aid basically. So I think all of this is to say that like there's been a lot of geopolitical and internal tensions leading up to this crisis, and sooner or later things were bound to explode.
So far you have mentioned Hamas, and I think something that people kind of struggle with in this situation is the question of whether supporting Palestinians means supporting Hamas, or to be more precise, when we support Palestine, the Palestinian resistance, we often face this kind of retort of like, well, that means you're on the side of terror, you're on the side of Hamas. And kind of understandably from the Zionist perspective, there's this effort to like legitimize the war against Gaza and the Palestinian people under this pretext of fighting terror and kind of like simplifying the conflict in that respect. And so I mean, this is going to sound like kind of a silly question because obviously we don't believe this, but does supporting Palestinians mean supporting Hamas? And if we support Palestinian resistance, does that mean that we support Hamas's methods and strategy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think our starting point from understanding our position in terms of the conflict in Palestine and also our relationship to Hamas, like as Marxists, we always start by analyzing the concrete situation, right? And for us, like what's happening right now and what has been historically happening in the previous struggles against that have been led by different leaderships of the Palestinian resistance have been struggles against US imperialism and struggles on the part of the oppressed, right? Because the Palestinians are an oppressed group against US imperialism and by extension the state of Israel. And so for us, similar to the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, where like US imperialism was concretely attacking and intervening against an oppressed nation, our position is to take the military side of the oppressed, which in this case is the Palestinian resistance. Of course, as we know, the leadership of the Palestinian resistance right now is Hamas, and I'll get to our differences with Hamas in a second. But the reason why I wanted to stress like why it's so important for us strategically that the Palestinian resistance wins is that it would imply a defeat for US imperialism, right? And it would weaken the ability of the imperialist bourgeoisie to advance its agenda, which attacks workers here in the US, but also around the world. So at the same time, while we have that position as Marxists, as revolutionaries, we know that Hamas wants a bourgeois theocratic state similar to the one in Iran. There's also other differences in terms of strategy. And, in these situations, we don't politically subordinate ourselves to the leaderships of these movements. Like Hamas right now has popular support. But for us, in a situation where we have obviously a different strategy and a different program than Hamas, we would put forward a political struggle and not leave that space open, right? And try to win over the trust of the Palestinian masses who are going through a struggle, a very progressive struggle, right, against US imperialism that has the potential to shake the world, right, to inspire working people around the world. But for us, we would put forward a perspective that, on the first hand, emphasizes a struggle from below because Hamas is super bureaucratic. Like, I mean, an expression of that is that they haven't had elections in Gaza in like 10 years. They make decisions from the top. We think that this resistance and this struggle should be organized from below. And that, Hamas's strategy actually hinders the development of self organization. And then on the other hand, for us, our strategy is based on the methods of the working class. It's based on the working class using its power as workers to shut down production, to unify with other workers and go on a general strike, and to combine this power, obviously, with the development of self-defense organizations, that are capable of advancing this struggle. But essentially, like, we have a totally different vision for how this struggle should be played out and what our ends should be than Hamas. And so we try to delimitate ourselves in that sense, while also putting forward a position that fully supports the right to self-determination of Palestinians in their struggle against US imperialism.
Yeah, totally. I mean, from my understanding, Hamas's program is to establish an Islamist state, and they have a pretty reactionary political project, which also relies on alliances with bourgeois Muslim governments like in Iran and Qatar and in other places.
Yeah, yeah. And so, like, that relationship is important. Hamas also has a historic relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think, as we saw with like the Arab Spring, like, there's a lot of national Islamist bourgeoisies, and like, that's not our end goal either. We and I'll elaborate a little bit on why I think this is in particular linked to a struggle for socialism around the world. But like, not even national bourgeoisies like have a relationship with imperialism, right? Like, they'll choose, when push comes to shove, as we've seen throughout history, the imperialist bourgeoisie over the working masses, even in their own countries, even if they have an anti-imperialist rhetoric. So for us, like, to actually get a free Palestine, we need a socialist Palestine, and we need to put forward a proletarian led struggle that obviously unites different oppressed groups to actually defeat our class oppressors, which are actually one and the same in the end. Like, the people who are oppressing Palestinians are oppressing us here. So actually, in that way, like, our struggles are super, super linked as working people here in the US, in the Arab world, in Europe, throughout the Middle East, in Latin America, and other parts of the world.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a really key point, and we will definitely get back to the question of strategy and things like that. I wanted to shift a little bit and talk about the context internationally as well as the response to the current crisis in Palestine. So, from my understanding, since around I think 2007 when the blockade started against the Gaza Strip, there have been around I think 6 wars against Gaza. And I mean, to just name a couple of the most recent events, there have been the 2018 March of Return protests, the 2021 siege, even most recently. But something feels very different about this moment right now. Like, something feels very different about this response internationally. And we can see that just kind of from like the huge mobilizations we've seen across the US, but also in the UK, in France. I mean, in France and Germany, I think protesters have basically defied bans that the government has tried to implement on pro Palestinian mobilizations. So I wanted to ask you if the international community is turning on the US and Israel, and why you think that might be the case right now.
Yeah, I love this question because for me, it really plants the seeds of a lot of hope, right? Because I think, like, everyone around me, it feels like, is waking up to something that I think a lot of us knew was happening, but they're finally seeing it with their own eyes. And I think this isn't or disconnected from the sort of shifts in consciousness that we've been seeing among youth, working people around the world who, in the face of environmental catastrophe, in the face of, economic crises, in the face of what I was saying earlier, the sort of like weakening of the US led imperialist order that, as we know, is in crisis, are questioning in a deeper way a lot of aspects of this system. And I think that, thinking about my generation, for example, like, one thing that I think is really interesting is, we grew up under the shadow of the reactionary wars of the early 2000s. And when I was growing up, I was like, okay, well, maybe it's just a Bush problem, right? And then I had all this hope and I voted for Obama and I was like, he's going to end the wars. And he turned out to be a drone king. So that was like my first like check mark, like, okay, something is up. It's not just the Republicans, right?
Definitely very formative for millennials, I think, the
Yeah.
Obama election. Yeah.
And I think now it's going even deeper because a lot of people in 2020 voted for who we now call Genocide Joe, um,
Yeah.
as a lesser evil to Trump. And it's really clear now that like imperialism is bipartisan, that, the Democratic Party has not only had a hand in the slaughter of Palestinian children right now, but historically has played an incredibly important role in maintaining imperialist interests under, a discourse of human rights and that sort of thing. But I think now, like it's really hard to stand up to everything we're seeing in social media, and even outlets like Al Jazeera, but even better, Left Voice, that's really showing us the reality of the situation in a lot of ways, because I know a lot of people are also seeing the contradictions of like bourgeois media in this moment. It's really hard for Joe Biden, who had an Oval Office address last week and was trying to continue to paint this image of the US and Israel as a peaceful democracy. Now we know that it's anything but, because, like our own democratic rights are being attacked here as well in universities, which especially in imperialist countries like the US, the Zionist influence is very strong. We're being attacked, sometimes by our own professors, even, which is insane. And, we're being repressed on the streets. We don't even really have a right to protest. In countries like France and Germany, there's been outright bans on protests. So I think it's just a lot of contradictions that people are waking up to, even when it comes to the war in Ukraine, for example, when the Democratic Party really tried to put forward this campaign of, we care about Ukrainian lives. And it's like, well, what about the genocide of the Palestinians, right? How could you say you care about anyone's life and sanction people in Iran? Like, it's just totally clear, especially to, I think, a lot of youth who, like I said, have been accelerating in their experience and the breaking of their illusions with the Democratic Party. But I think also what's really auspicious is that a lot of these youth are also Jewish. Like they're, the people who were peddled Zionism the most in a lot of ways. And they're seeing how, like Zionism has nothing to do with anti Semitism. It's a total imperialist project of oppression. And so it's really auspicious that there's also been a response from Jewish youth. And of course, like I was saying earlier, and like we were talking about, like there's been a response around the world, particularly in the Arab world and the Muslim world, who, in countries like Lebanon and Iraq, also in Iran, there's been recent important uprisings against neoliberal bourgeois regimes, who oftentimes collaborate with imperialism. So these same masses who have been part of these recent revolts are now standing in solidarity with Palestine and, in a lot of ways continuing their struggle, because in the end it's a struggle against the same system, like I was saying earlier. So I think it's really auspicious that there's been a response in the region. And then I think the other aspect of the response that's super important is the way in which we're seeing the labor movement and the workers movement and the working class in particular as its own actor, play a role in, obviously, starting from the trade unions in Palestine that put forward demands around, stopping the production and the transfer of Israeli arms, to the Starbucks workers who put out a statement in solidarity with Palestine. Um, I think that's also something that's like super important about what's happening right now.
So you spoke earlier about the strategy we put forward and how, the struggle is international, and we talked about the socialist perspective a bit. I wanted to talk a bit about the solutions that are being posed to this conflict, and also, like, obviously what we as socialists, as leftists, are specifically posing as a solution. So, I mean, here's where we kind of get back to maybe a more historical perspective. President Biden recently has been saying, we can't let a two-state solution die, and this seems to be what the consensus is, both among Democrats and Republicans. Correct me if I'm wrong, but we obviously do not support a two-state solution. Could you speak to why exactly we oppose a two-state solution and what we pose as the alternative to this?
Yeah, no, this is a great question because, like you said, Joe Biden is putting forward a politics of the two-state solution. Donald Trump also did. There's sectors of the left, unfortunately, that also believe that the solution to this crisis is a two-state solution. And, starting from the way that the regime, the imperialist regime here in particular, thinks about a two-state solution, to me, their idea of a two-state solution sounds almost utopian, especially in the current context, because what it would imply is finding a new leadership for the Palestinians, for a Palestinian state that is not only subordinated to the interests of US imperialism, because they're not going to let, you know what I mean, a socialist Palestine
Totally.
exist,
Yeah.
but is also trusted by the Palestinian masses. That's essentially what they want when it comes to a two-state solution. But, for us, a two-state solution is not only a dead end because of that, but going further in what I was just saying, it would also imply an Israeli state that would peacefully coexist with a Palestinian one. When the entire project of Israel is rooted upon the colonization and subjugation of Palestinians. Because, like I was, as I've been mentioning, like, um, the project of Israel is a project that was established in the post war period. Also, a lot of people don't know this, with the support of Stalinism and the imperialist powers at that time, the UK and the US, to create a bastion of US interests in a region that was rich with a lot of natural resources, like, as we know, oil, and uses Zionist ideology to maintain those interests. So that's concretely what Israel is. And it's as authors like Ilan Pape have written about extensively, is based upon the quote unquote ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, and we're seeing this now with our own eyes. So yeah, it seems really crazy, right, to have a
Yeah.
two state.
Also, I
Um,
mean, just like literally speaking, if you look at a map and you look at like what are the Palestinian territories and like the Israeli territories and things like that, I mean, even just looking at it literally like that, it's like, how is a two-state solution possible? Like, what borders under the current like governance? Like, there is just absolutely no way of making that work.
yeah, it's really just a fallacy at this point. But of course, like, what a two-state solution negates, which is our position, and as a perspective, like I was saying earlier, is a perspective that we also differ or delimitate ourselves from Hamas, is a single state, a single socialist state that is based on, like a workers in socialist Palestine where Arabs, Christians, and Jews can live in peace as they did in the past. And that entails, and this is why it's linked to a struggle for socialism, to get to that state is the state that we fight for politically entails attacking the material basis of oppression and exploitation of Palestinian workers, but also Jewish workers around the world, including in Israel. Because, like I was saying earlier, Israel is a capitalist country. There's private property, there's bosses in Israel. And so that is the most progressive solution to us is a state that is based on a socialist perspective. And it might sound like propagandistic, like, oh, you were just saying that like a Tuesday is a utopia. Like what you're saying sounds even more utopian. But I think like as Marxists, and especially seeing the development of this movement and knowing the contradictions of this system that have been accelerating in a lot of deep ways in recent years, we really bet and know that it's possible for working people around the world, workers and the oppressed, who are already taking to the streets, like, and organizing through their workplaces, organizing through their universities, taking up a banner of a free Palestine. Like, this is already unifying the working class in so many ways. Of course, it's not enough, but there's definitely a trend towards the development of a movement. And to me, taking from the logic of the permanent revolution and some of Trotsky's ideas, like the fate of the Palestinian working class is inextricably tied with the fate of the regional working class. Because if Arab workers who are so inspired by the progressive struggle of the Palestinians go on strike, if the oil workers in Iran who have been going on strike against their regime identify in their struggle as workers with the oppression of Palestinians and shut down production, then it's over. It's game over. So I think this idea of proletarian internationalism, or this idea that we can unite to defeat our common enemies, isn't as utopian as it seems. And I think that it has to be, obviously, like I was saying earlier, like based on a democratic reorganization of society too. We want these revolutions to be organized from below, but I think it's really auspicious that, you know, even what we were talking about earlier, the questioning among the youth, among Jewish workers, among even some Israelis who are like, I don't know if this project of Zionism is actually even great for me, you know? If I was a young person in Israel, like I don't know if I'd want to die in a war to kill other members of my class, and maybe that's going to become more clear as this conflict goes on. That's not out of the question. And so, yeah, there is a possibility for this struggle, which I think can turn into a very progressive one, to take on a different path. And that's the path that we fight for as socialists.
Yeah, I think this is a really good place to kind of start to wrap this conversation up. I mean, I always like to end on the note of like concretely what are the tasks for the left, particularly the left in the United States. And we've seen, as you've already discussed, the fact that like voting blue, voting for the Democrats is not going to solve this conflict. I mean, we always say that, you know, so much of politics is bipartisan, but I mean, imperialism is like really bipartisan. And support for Israel is like, sorry to use a cliche, but I mean, as American as apple pie here in terms of sending weapons shipments, giving military aid, and things like that. So, could you comment a little bit on specifically what the tasks are for the US left going forward?
Yeah, no, this is a really good question. Like, what do we do in the here and now to advance this struggle, right? And I think, like I was saying, there's already like seeds of a movement, but I think we need to fight as much as possible to massify that movement, to talk to all the people around us who are like pissed off about what's going on. My mom sent me this crazy video earlier, and she's just like, I don't know what to do. And I'm like, Mom, there's a protest on Saturday. See you there. So, like I think in the spirit of the Black Lives Matter movement and other recent mass movements around the world, we need to take to the streets. We need to denounce Israel and the offensive. We need to denounce US imperialism, especially the Democrats, which are behind this conflict, which are sending aid to this conflict. And we need to call for a mass movement that's not only organized in the streets, but also in our workplaces, in our universities. And as I was saying earlier, like the state is not going to be peaceful about our movement. We saw this during BLM. They tried to repress us. We're seeing it now in the universities and the attacks that we're facing. And
Totally.
so it's very important that we raise democratic demands in that spirit and we put forward demands that confront these attacks to strengthen our movements and to develop confidence among those who are part of these movements. And so I think that's key towards developing this struggle in the here and now. I think at the same time, like a lot of people right now are like, similar to BLM, looking for political education. So I hope that's why they're listening to this podcast and reading Left Voice. They're looking to join an organization because, they realize that like their path to freedom is collective. It's not going to be through an individual activism, right? And also are realizing that like they need to be a part of an organization that has a perspective, and which I tried to elaborate on throughout the course of this discussion, including, our delimitation from the Democrats, our perspective that we need to unify the ranks of the working class. In that spirit, also fight against both Islamophobia and anti Semitism as part of our movement, and obviously use our power as workers, as students, to actually to fight for our freedom, right? Like we have a strategy that has been in some ways tested by history that we have to go back to. But I think we can't organize this like on our own. We need organizations that defend these ideas, that are able to intervene in these movements and are able to link internationally with other people who share in this perspective, because we know that this struggle is completely international. So I think now is a great time when people are politicized and are realizing that like, this is going to be a long-term struggle, and this is, a struggle that's linked to tearing down the bases of the system, to join an organization. And that's why we've been putting forward a call for a working class party that fights for socialism here as Left Voice, in a moment where there's a historic strike of UAW workers that's also going on, in addition to this incipient struggle in solidarity with Palestine. So I think it's a very contradictory moment because on the one hand, 5,000 siblings of ours were murdered brutally, many of them children who had futures, who might have been, revolutionaries, right? So we don't take that lightly. But at the same time, I think the best way to honor those martyrs is to dedicate our lives to struggling until our last breath and to fighting for organizations that want to do the same.
Yeah, I have just one final thing to say, which is from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free.
I have a lot of hope that it will. And I hope that you and I will continue fighting together toward that goal.
Mariam, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.